The most famous mutiny in history is of course the mutiny on the Bounty, when Fletcher Christian overthrew Captain Bligh, and set him and his loyal crewmen in a small boat. While many are familiar with that story, the mutiny on the HMS Hermione is a lesser-known but no less shocking tale of insurrection and violence on the high seas. This mutiny was a massacre in comparison. Of all mutinies in British history, the HMS Hermino mutiny was the bloodiest and most brutal mutiny of them all. This is Mutiny History with Magnus. But before we start, please like and subscribe, it really helps the channel with the algorithms, and blah blah blah, let's get to it. The ship was very successful when it was sent to the Mona Passage, between the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico, where she destroyed 3 privateers in March 1797. 1 month later, Hermione was the lead ship, in a squadron formed of the frigates HMS Mermaid, Quebec, Drake, and the cutter Penelope. The squadron took out 9 ships at the Battle of Jean Rabel, without suffering any casualties. 6 months later, she was in company with HMS Diligence and Renami, when Diligence captured a Spanish ship, along with its crew. With success like that, Captain Pigott was sure to be greatly honored when he returned home. He might even be in line for a new promotion. However, Captain Pigott was a cruel officer, who handed out severe and arbitrary punishments for the smallest misdeeds, something that would soon lead to great discontent among the crew. During his 9 months as captain of his previous ship, HMS Success, he ordered at least 85 floggings, the equivalent of half the crew on the ship, with 2 of the flogged men dying from their injuries. He would continue his brutal ways, also when taking command of the HMS Hermino. The demotion and treatment of Midshipman David Casey, an experienced junior officer who had distinguished himself earlier on the ship, was one of the primary reasons to the mutiny. About a week before the mutiny, David Casey was at his station on the main top, and Pigott noticed that a gasket, one of the ties that held the sail securely, had not been tied properly by one of the sailors under Casey's supervision. Brought before Captain Pigott, Casey humbly apologized and took responsibility for the failure. The captain was not satisfied with this and demanded that Casey apologize on his knees, a very much unacceptable and degrading demand of an officer and a gentleman. Casey refused the humiliation the captain demanded, twice, and thus Pigott ordered that he receive 12 lashes, something that was a sailor's punishment, not that of a junior officer, and he was reduced in rank, which would effectively end his career as a naval officer. On September 20, 1797, Captain Pigott ordered the top sails to be reefed after a sudden violent gust of wind struck the ship. Unimpressed with the speed of the men, he gave the order that the last men off the yard would be flogged. This policy was particularly preposterous, because the men would be spaced along the sails, and the 2 whose stations were furthest out would always be the last down. This led to a fierce race down the ropes, in order not to be flogged. In their desperate attempts at not getting flogged, 3 young sailors fell to their deaths on the deck. One of the falling sailors hit and injured the master, Mr. Southcott, when he fell down. Pigott ordered their bodies thrown into the sea, with the particularly offensive insult in the seaman's vocabulary:
"Throw the lubbers overboard."
And when the top men complained, he ordered 2 boatswain's mates to flog all of the top men, which were followed by a new flogging the next morning. Casey, who had been humiliated a week before, was a popular officer amongst the crew, and they felt that he was punished unfairly, and it was the combination of Casey's humiliation and the floggings of the top men that triggered the mutiny. On the evening of September 21, 1797, a number of drunken sailors overpowered the Marines stationed outside of Captain Pigott's cabin. The mutiny was led by Jonathan Robbins, a sailor who had been impressed into service on the ship. Robbins was a charismatic figure who had a reputation for being a tough and capable sailor. He had a loyal following among the crew, who were drawn to his strong leadership and his willingness to stand up to the officers. They knew that they needed to act quickly and decisively if they were to succeed, and they were determined to take control of the ship and escape to a foreign port. Pigott later testified that he saw the second lieutenant's servant, James Allen, with a tomahawk or hatchet in his hand, and that he exclaimed, "Let me have a cut at him." On receiving this deposition from Pigott, a general groan of horror was heard in court. Pigott then observed a band of crewmen dragging the second lieutenant across the deck, while he repeatedly stretched out his hand, crying, "Mercy, mercy." He was drawn up the ladder to the deck by the hair of his head. The testimony by a surviving midshipman describes the behavior of the mutineers as truly savage and brutal. The officer Mackintosh was dying of yellow fever when the mutineers dragged him from his bunk and threw him alive into the sea. The mutineers were initially led by about 18 men, and their killing spree killed another 8 officers, along with 2 midshipmen. All the bodies were unceremonially thrown overboard. But fearing retribution for their actions, the mutineers decided to navigate the ship towards Spanish waters. One reason the master's life was spared was that Turner could not navigate the ship properly without his help. Eventually, the HMS Hermione sailed to La Guaira, where the mutineers handed the ship over to the Spanish authorities. The mutineers claimed they had set the officers adrift in a small boat, as had happened in the mutiny on the Bounty some 8 years earlier. The Spanish authorities, however, were not impressed with their actions and gave the mutineers just $25 each in return. The mutineers were presented with the options of joining the Spanish colonial army, heavy labor, or being employed in refitting their ship. The Spaniards took over the HMS Hermione and renamed it the Santa Cecilia. Her crew included 25 of her former crew, who remained under Spanish guard. Only one of the small detachment of Marines on board participated in the mutiny, while the half-dozen remaining were too outnumbered and taken by surprise to oppose the mutineers. They remained under the leadership of a sergeant and insisted on being treated as prisoners of war by the Spanish authorities. Meanwhile, news of the fate of HMS Hermione reached Admiral Sir Hyde Parker when HMS Diligence captured a Spanish schooner. Parker wrote to the governor of La Guaira, demanding the return of the ship and the surrender of the mutineers. He dispatched HMS Magicienne under Captain Henry Ricketts to commence negotiations. Parker also set up a system of informers and posted rewards that eventually led to the capture of 33 of the mutineers, some of whom were tried aboard HMS York, and at least one aboard HMS Gladiator. Of these, 24 were hanged and gibbeted, and 8 were acquitted or pardoned. The mutiny was the bloodiest in British naval history and forced the British to re-evaluate their practices of handling the crew. The incident highlighted the need for better working conditions and treatment of sailors, including improving the quality of food and water on board ships, introducing better medical care, and increasing pay and incentives for sailors. The mutiny on the Hermione also had a lasting cultural impact. The incident inspired several literary works, including a play by Thomas Holcroft and a novel by Frederick Marryat. The story of the mutiny was also depicted in several paintings and illustrations. I hope you liked this presentation, and if you did, give it a thumbs up and subscribe. And please check out my other videos on this channel, to see if there are more you would find interesting. And I hope to see you in the next one.